Well, I guess my military service began when my first year in college. I went to what was called Colorado College of Education in Greeley. There was a policy there that if you joined the National Guard, you had your tuition paid. So of course that was during the Depression, and so I jumped at the chance. Greeley had two National Guard companies. One was Headquarters Company, the other was a machine gun company. Company M, 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry. I enlisted in that, had my tuition paid, and then when I didn't return to Greeley, of course I had to drop out. 3rd Battalion was particularly distinguished itself in World War II because they took 300% casualties. I never went back to college then. And then I worked for 2 years in Denver at the Gardner-Denver Company. And May 3rd, 1939, I joined the Air Unit, Colorado National Guard, 120th Observation Squadron. I tried to get into that outfit. A vacancy had to exist before you could get into it. So this one day I happened to be out at the airport. They had a B-10 bomber out there. So there was nobody around, so I got up in the thing. I got up in the cockpit, the rear cockpit. And pretty soon a guard came around and he says, "You get out of there." I just wanted to look at the airplane. I wanted to get a close-up look at it. He said, "Do you belong to the National Guard?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well," I said, "if I belong to the National Guard, can I get in the airplane?" He says, "Of course you could." So I went in and signed my name and got in the National Guard. They had one vacancy. I came home wearing a uniform, and my dad says, "What in the hell did you do now?" That was May 3rd, 1939. At that time, that unit was attached to the 45th Division. The 45th Division had a yellow swastika on a red background. The 120th got new airplanes. We were flying biplanes up till then. We got our new planes that were O-47s. They were single-engine mid-wing bomb observation aircraft. And of course, all our pilots were trying to build up time in them, and they'd go to different things around the country on cross-country flights. Colorado University played Rice University in Houston. And of course, several of our pilots took their airplanes, took off on a cross-country to attend that football game. And this was when the German-American Bund was fairly active in the United States. And they walked into the stadium, and a lot of members of the German-American Bund were there, and they gave them the Nazi salute. Well, that swastika was an Indian sign. It had nothing to do with the Nazis. But anyway, the press got a hold of it, and a big stink was made. So it wasn't shortly after that they changed the insignia from the swastika to the Thunderbird. I remember taking that swastika patch off of my uniform and throwing it in the trash. The thing is worth money now. I mean, my gosh, worth maybe $100 or so now. And then after that, we went into the 24th Cavalry Division, which was National Guard. They were horse cavalry. Then the next year, of course, was 1940, and that's when the draft started. You had had up until sometime in September 1940 to make up your mind whether you were in or out. I was wearing a uniform similar to this. When my name was called and I answered here, I was staying in. Our squadron was inducted into active service officially on January the 6th, 1941, we became part of the 1st Cavalry Division, and they were located in Fort Bliss, Texas. And we lived in tents for most of the year of 41. One of the regiments in the 1st Cavalry Division was the 7th Cavalry, which was Custer's outfit. I was in the photographic section. We did all kinds of aerial reconnaissance photography, ground photography, everything. We had all kinds of photo equipment. And they had a picture of Custer that was taken during the Civil War in his general's uniform. But the photograph was, I guess it might have been on a tintype. It was pretty well beat up. And they brought it in and says, is there anything that you can do with this? And actually, it came out very well. And here is this is the result. And I think maybe I made a dozen prints. They said, well, we want a whole bunch of these. So my gosh, must have made over 100. I had to take the print of each one of them and hand touch it, retouch it to get the spots out of it. Incidentally, there's a picture of me in 1941. I'm wearing my A2 jacket with a squadron patch. This is what I got for all the work I did on the Custer picture. I was made an honorary member, and this is the Gary Owen badge from this Irish cavalry regiment. And their motto was Gary Owens, so Custer adopted that for his regiment. Years later, I was going through a bookstore, and I picked up this book, Bugles, Banners, and War Bonnets. Here was the picture that I had worked on, the same photograph. So of course I bought the book. The job that I had been trained for, an aerial photographer, was obsolete. Everything from then on was automated. They didn't need a guy up there in an airplane with a camera. They just mounted the cameras in the airplanes. I applied for flight training as a pilot in the liaison squadron. I couldn't pass the flight exam. They'd put you in a chair, spin it around, I don't know how many times, and then you had to get up out of the chair, stand up straight, and walk along a 10-foot line without stepping outside of that line. I couldn't do that, so I flunked it. The next best thing was to apply for OCS, which I did. I was accepted. And I was sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. We had to run the obstacle course every 2 weeks. I had trouble making it through the obstacle course because I get a little bit of touch of asthma. So they finally caught up with me and washed me out. They said if you were in the ground forces, we'd give you a medical discharge right here, because you're not, with asthma, you're not supposed to be in the Army. Medical discharge was the one thing I didn't want. So anyway, I got back to Biggs Field in Texas, in El Paso. They didn't know what to do with me. They had a photo section and a photo lab with all of my old squadron's equipment in it, and I was the only man on the base with a bona fide photo MOS. And the photo officer that was in charge was Wyman J. Aaroncrook, who was a captain in the Reserve Air Corps, the principal at East High School in civilian life. He says, well, what are we supposed to do with you? And I says, well, I'm supposed to get a medical discharge, but I don't want a medical discharge. You keep a low profile. He says, don't go on sick call, and maybe your papers will get lost. And I eventually became NCO in charge of the photo lab. That's where I fought the war. Now, I had an easy war, too darned easy, and I feel guilty about it. Here were all my buddies getting shot up and everything, and here I was sitting back there in Texas. And I'd completed my enlistment pretty much in December 1941, and I was due to get out in January. December the 6th, 1941, I ran into one of my buddies from personnel, and he says, do you know that the old man has your discharge on his desk, ready to be signed? So I took off and went to town, went downtown El Paso, and bought a bunch of civilian clothes. And all of this stuff had to be altered. So I says, well, I'll come in later on and after you alter it and pick it up. The next day, I decided, well, I don't have anything to do, so I'll just go downtown and maybe take in a movie. So anyway, I went to a bar and I got rid of several beers, and then I went to the movies. So I got up during the intermission to dispose of some of that beer that I had been drinking, and when I came back from the intermission, the place was empty. The theater was empty. When I went to the men's room, they'd announced that Pearl Harbor, and they said all military personnel report back to the bases. Well, the place was full of military personnel, so they all left. So I got on the streetcar and a bus and went back to base. When I got back to the base, they said, get out of those civilian clothes, pack them up and send them home. Called up the department store the next day and I said, forget about all those clothes I bought. We patrolled the border as a photo recon outfit. We did run border patrol from the Arizona border to Laredo, Texas. My job was the photography and the processing of the film and the printing of the making prints and all. I was sitting at my desk in the section, and a big, tall captain walked in, and he was wearing a B3 jacket. That's the fur-lined jacket with a fur collar on it. And he had the fur collar turned up, and it was a warm day. And I thought, gosh, that guy looks familiar. My gosh, that's Clark Gable. And he wore that jacket around because he didn't want to be recognized. He was in photography, and he wanted to look around the lab. The whole section quit working and came up to the front office, and the officer in charge came up as well. And he said, you know, he said, here you are, over military age, and you had everything going for you, and you enlisted as a private. And Gable says, well, where else is a man supposed to be? And after he left, I said, turned to my section, I says, well, now you guys know why you're here. And then I got a picture, one of the guys took a picture. Jimmy Stewart come in one day flying in, he was, I think maybe he was a captain or a lieutenant then. I developed a technique for taking a picture instead of dropping a bomb. Every bombardier had a 35mm camera that he could operate along with his bomb sight. The initial point, they started their bomb run. They did not change course. That's why we lost so many bombers, because they couldn't take evasive action. The enemy fighters always got out of the way because they didn't want to come in contact with that flak. We simulated that with 35mm photography. When they reached their initial point, you could start the camera going. Usually they'd go through a whole roll of film and be out of film by the time they got to their target. So I developed a technique where they, instead of starting the film going, they only took one picture at the initial point and went over the target. Well, that saved a lot of film and a lot of manpower. Now, they actually did that during in combat missions. They'd use the same technique. As soon as the lead bombardier would release his bombs, they photographed those bombs from the time they left the airplane until the time they hit the target. And that's what you see in all of the combat footage. Every machine gun and bomber had a 35mm camera attached to it and synchronized with the firing of it. And the camera would photograph the tracers and the target. That was all done with a 16mm camera that was attached to each gun. My section was responsible for processing all of that stuff. I designed my patch. I didn't design it. What I did, I made them out of white leather. I made one for my own flight jacket. I got this big whole goat skin of white leather. I made it with the India ink and leather dye. I was discharged in October 1945. Well, anyway, that's how I fought the war.